be. Mine certainly was. Um, Now we're moving into a slightly different register for this panel. If we thought we were maybe beginning to cover everything we thought we could cover, this panel actually takes us, I think, in a completely different direction again. So I'm really excited to chair this and introduce the speakers. We'll do the same format where we will have both talks, and then at the end we'll go to a discussion and questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jasper Montana for our first talk. Jasper is a senior lecturer at the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science here at the ANU, and an honorary research associate at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. So Jasper's research interests encompass science policy relations, theories and practices of transdisciplinarity, bridging the local and the global, the influence of concepts, which is very intriguing, metrics and technologies, biodiversity loss. And Jasper's particularly interested in contemporary social challenges that draw from and contribute to science and technology studies, science communication, political ecology, and other interdisciplinary environmental sciences. So the first talk is entitled Susie and the Dark Vessels, Satellite Data, Environmental Subjects, and Fable in Ocean Governance. Thanks, Jasper.
All right, I'll just need to move this because I need to be able to click the screen. Hi, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here today to talk to you about some of the research which I've done over the past few years, thinking about environmental governance. And I applied for this to join this event today, just in a spirit of kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary dialogue. And to see how I could be inspired and informed by the conversations that we could have today. And it's proven very fruitful so far. So I look forward to sharing with you some of my own thinking. Essentially, my main interest is in people and nature relations. So specifically how us as people kind of live in the world, think about the world, make sense of the world. And I study mostly how scientists and policymakers are generating data, generating knowledge, and making decisions about this relationship between people and nature. So how do we live better with the rest of life around us? And I'm interested in this. I mean, I started life as a zoologist, and I was very interested in kind of counting animals and understanding their behaviors. And there's a lot of data out there about kind of the biophysical world. So what's going on out there? How many species are there? What's happening to those species? But fundamentally, what I discovered after a while thinking about kind of nature conservation and biodiversity is that actually, fundamentally, this is a human problem, that the biodiversity loss impacts people through, well, by shaping the world around us through pollution, increasing the risks of pandemics and other social impacts, and also just limiting the resources that we have around us. But it's also driven by people. So humans are at the heart of the drivers of biodiversity loss. And this is a diagram that was put together by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a United Nations-backed expert group. And essentially, they've identified these things on the left as being what are called the indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So these are the things that kind of are really at the base or foundation of the problem. Unfortunately, they're really vague. So if you look at them as kind of demographics and socio-cultural, whatever that means, economic and technological, institutions and governance, conflicts and epidemics. And the problem is that the people that produce these reports that work in environmental spaces often don't have the expertise to understand or to even kind of conceptualize, to monitor, to think about how do we actually make sense of these categories. They know these categories exist and they put them in their diagrams, but they're not actually, to date, largely prepared to understand the foundations of the problem. They're very good at telling us about the kind of the direct manifestations of the problem in the impacts on species and things like that. Much of the work over the past kind of couple of decades around the relationship between people and nature has been through this thing called ecosystem services, which is an idea that nature provides humans with particular goods and services that we can then use and extract, and we should protect nature so that we can maintain these services. But then the relationship between people and nature becomes one of just an arrow. So really, the thing that drives me is trying to work out how do we move away from just thinking about the relationship between people and nature as just an arrow, and make it take account of culture, the social world that we live in, ideas of politics, broader questions about what it means to kind of be social beings in a very interesting and diverse world. So that's what has brought me here. In thinking about people and nature, I saw the call for papers, and I wondered, I wonder if Fable could be a form of knowledge about people and nature relations, and what could we learn from that? The other dimension of interest was the AI component, and AI is increasingly being used in a lot of environmental research, and I'm going to briefly touch on some of that today. But I've just recently led a paper that was published in the journal Gaia about this thing called novel natures. And there's a debate in conservation around what do we do with these new configurations of species that we're creating through introduced species, obviously as a result of colonialism. Also kind of reclaim landscapes. So landscapes that were industrial and then that we've decided that we're going to kind of regenerate them. They look a bit natural, but they look a bit unnatural. They might have a path going through the center. They might have train tracks, but then they're all overgrown. So there's a bit of human, bit of nature. Is this natural? Is it nature? What do we do with it? And for a long time, well, if you look at lots of this discourse in environmental governance, there's a lot of talk of this idea of integrity and ecosystem integrity, and it's also ecosystem degradation, which rests on an assumption that there is this kind of pristine ideal of what a nature is. And I think it's a really interesting parallel with some of the things coming out of generative AI, because to ask whether or not a kind of artwork that are generated by a generative AI artwork thing, is it art? Is a question that I think parallels in some respects the question, is this nature? These new configurations that have somehow been shaped. On one hand, you have computers and computer systems generating images. In this case, you have humans intervening in and shaping nature. But I think the question parallel is there. Okay, so today I'd like to take us on a journey up into space and then back down to Earth. And I'm going to explore how the use of data from remote sensing by satellites is being developed within environmental governance. So remote sensing technologies such as satellites offer access to viewpoints beyond human perception, from oceanic processes to the dynamics of major urban centers. Remote sensing technologies, for some, promise heightened forms of objectivity. So they take kind of perception all the way out into space, far from the reach of humans and the human eye. And therefore, they signal, for some, a new era of accountability where we can kind of monitor the actions of all of us here on Earth through gathering data from satellites. And you see this in some of the work being done to monitor greenhouse gas emissions by satellites, which means that you can hold individual actors accountable by looking at where are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. In combination with machine learning technologies, remote sensing and other Earth observation technologies offer powerful new means of more automated monitoring of life on Earth, and they can also fill data gaps in parts of the world that are understudied because of lack of resourcing or inaccessible to ground-based researchers. And here, remote sensing, basically, the combination with AI is essentially these things can take lots and lots of photographs, more than humans can, or like humans could in a normal working day kind of look at. And then they use the automated machine learning techniques to spot, to either analyze the photograph and tell you what's going on and measure things, or tell you if there's something there or there's not something there. So presence, absence type analysis. So critical scholars have challenged the widely held misconception amongst many techno-scientific communities that these digitally mediated data production offers a somehow neutral, more comprehensive view of the planet. Rather, as Nost and Goldstein, who are political ecologists, have written, these data infrastructures, including the platforms, devices, and institutions that create the data, are shaped by uneven distribution of resources and power, and they're put to use for very explicitly human purposes. Indeed, for this reason, there's a need for scholarship and policy on the advancement of environmental data infrastructures to attend to value-laden choices around what data is being produced, how it's being produced, why it's being produced, how it represents the world, and what it makes visible and invisible. And this is partly what I seek to do today. So much of the scholarship that's looked at environmental representation in environmental governance has focused on ways of seeing. So the ways in which we kind of come to look at the world in a particular way. And a quite important text in this has been James Scott's Seeing Like a State, which looks at a number of case studies to explain how states, so nation states, have come to see the world in particular ways. Specifically, this example here is about forestry and the ways in which state-based forestry has led us to see trees through this kind of uniform monoculture that can be measurable through, as long as we plant the trees in a particular way and we plant the same type of trees, we can then monitor and monetize nature for our own purposes. So there's been a big emphasis on the production of knowledge and ways of seeing. And what I'm trying to do through this work is also to emphasize the importance of the spaces of reception of knowledge. So in particular, I'm thinking about how knowledge is not only produced, but it's also brought into institutional cultures. So things like legal settings or policy settings, both within nation states and also at the multi-government level. And these are prime examples where kind of bureaucratic processes and institutionalized assumptions about what kinds of information is valid or not valid can really influence how data and knowledge is interpreted and made sense of. So for me, attending to both the production and the reception of environmental knowledge is particularly relevant for thinking about remote sense data, where the use of satellites kind of somehow tries to claim, in many cases, a clear separation between the site of production and its use. So towards this goal, the paper examines the question, what happens when remotely sensed data from satellites comes down to Earth in the aid of marine governance? And just to further frame my thinking, I just wanted to explain how my scholarship is certainly informed by what's called a co-productionist stance. So this is co-production grapples with this question of the ways in which we come to know and perceive the world are shaped by our value systems about how we choose to live in it. So two examples, just to kind of further clarify this, is one is about like the image of the globe and the idea of the global society and the ways in which science over decades has kind of helped us or worked towards building this idea of a global collective that somehow can make decisions, that the world can somehow be studied as one through the production of knowledge about climate change and global average temperatures. And that then this also means that we can live together as one, that we can make collective decisions about how to live in the world through intergovernmental processes. And that these two things come together along at the same time, that they're kind of, they're co-produced, they're inseparable as modes of thinking. And the other example is the production of the African elephant through intergovernmental negotiations around the protection of species that essentially the identity of the elephant as a scientific category is produced by the expectations within an intergovernmental setting about where boundaries are, like where political boundaries lie, so that our scientific categories and legal categories are co-produced or connected based on the kinds of social arrangements that we put in place to produce those categories. Hopefully it will become, hopefully my case study will also add an additional explanation of that, but I'm happy to talk more about that. Okay, so the context for my talk today is the rise of technological development within environmental governance. Remote sensing, including satellites, drones, and sensors, are increasingly important. And they form part of what, particularly in the ocean space, they form part of what Karen Backer has referred to as the smart ocean. So this is the idea of having all these sensors all over the place that can track animals, track ships, monitor sea temperatures, and therefore we can build more responsive policy arrangements for managing the ocean. And I think that the ocean is a significant site for this inquiry because for a long time, it was considered a space beyond governance, this idea that the ocean is a frontier and that it's beyond civilization. This, of course, has since, so this is back kind of centuries ago, but that kind of echo of the frontier mentality around the ocean still persists. But the ocean has attempted, there have been attempts to tame the ocean through governance mechanisms. And these specifically have been done by the UN. So this is a image that represents the legal agreements that have been created around how we should think about the ocean as a space in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that actually looks at these kind of, it creates distances from the coastline that are within government jurisdiction and then distances from the coastline that are outside of government jurisdiction. Essentially, it creates a territorial regime, so a landed planar idea of territorial and sovereign ownership over space for the ocean that we're typically used to seeing on land because it somehow makes sense on land, this idea of this kind of the surface of the land as being something that we can't penetrate. Obviously, we do mining and things like that. But within the kind of governance logics, it's a planar surface. And then applying that to the ocean happened at this time in the 1980s through the Law of the Sea. And then that's permeated out throughout other modes of interacting with nature within the ocean through the governance of fisheries, which are all based on, again, intergovernmental agreements. And you can participate in the intergovernmental agreements if your country falls within a particular zone. And these are some of the fishing zones within the ocean. And also the creation of conservation areas within the ocean, which this is a marine protected area set up in Hawaii in 2009, 2010. Essentially, these fall within government jurisdictions. So governments can protect the ocean that they have power over. They can't protect areas of the ocean that is beyond their jurisdictional control. But jurisdictions are based on a kind of planar, straightforward territorial logic. However, this hasn't sat easily with everyone. This territorial approach, geographers have responded to it calling for what they say are wet ontologies. And they argue that the marine realm should be seen and governed as a space of fluidity, volume, emergence, depth, and liquidity. And we start to see this in some of the data that comes back from remote sensing and tracking by satellites, because these technologies can allow us to see more than human mobilities. So things that move beyond government jurisdictions and move in space up and down through in interesting ways. And these are some images of, on the far right, we've got shipping activity, and on the left, we have animal tracks from birds, I think those are. Okay, so Susie and the Dark Targets is the title that I've given, the Dark Vessels is the title I've given to the talk. Essentially, this is a paper that explores these two cases of not more than human mobilities. Susie is a turtle in the Caribbean that is tracked by scientists working on a conservation project. And dark vessels are boats that are evading detection by satellite by switching off one of their transmitters. They become dark vessels, but governments have worked out a way to detect them, even though they're not transmitting anymore, by using another form of satellite technology, which takes photographs of the ocean. And then they use AI to compare the photographs and the transmissions. And if they can see the boat in the photographs, but not in the transmissions, they become dark vessels as a category. And these two cases that I looked at are based in the UK overseas territories. So these are the UK overseas territories are 14 islands and archipelagos that are still owned or possessed or kind of governed by the UK. And the two that I looked at in this paper were the Turks and Caicos Islands here and Ascension Island there. Right, so the case of Susie was part of what was called the Turks and Caicos Islands Turtle Project. And essentially, the idea was that how do we govern, in the Turks and Caicos Islands, the local fisher people still eat turtles. They catch them, consume them, sell them. And the conservation teams from the Marine Conservation Society in the UK and the UK government were looking at how do we make this turtle harvesting sustainable. So they worked with the local communities to do a monitoring program by measuring the turtles that they found in the water, but also putting satellite tags on them and releasing them and tracking them. The other case was around Ascension Island, which is in the South Atlantic. And here they were using satellites, as I said, to monitor fishing activity and comparing the data coming from the transmissions from the ships compared to these photographs. So with the turtle tracking project, they had 17 satellite tags on hawksbill and green turtles. And essentially, they attached the tags and then they received this kind of data. So it was kind of tracking data where the turtles are swimming around. And then they can understand where they're moving within the Caribbean. And with the fishing data, you get a bit of a map like this. So this, you can actually go online and look at the live data from vessels transmitting what's called AIS signals. And you can actually see a world map like this that has all the ships that are out there in the ocean right now. And you can run it back. So you can look at the last year of shipping activity and you see all the boats like zooming around and you can track individual vessels. But any of these boats can switch off their AIS. So they're legally required to have it on, but they can switch off if they want to do something shady, or they can scramble the location so that it jumps to a different location. And this is the thing that the group called Ocean Mind, which is a UK-based not-for-profit organization, was working with the UK government to try and develop ways of using AI and machine learning to monitor for dark vessels in UK overseas territory waters. So as I said, my question here was, how does this remotely sensed data from satellites come down to Earth? And the reason why I think this is interesting is because satellite data essentially creates these things that can be theorized as minimal animals. So minimal animals is a concept that was developed by someone called Benson. And it's essentially this idea that when we track things through geolocation, essentially we end up with just dots on a white screen. You wouldn't even get the map behind. That's already more context than you'd get just from the tracking data itself. It strips the animal or the being, whatever it is, human or not, of its kind of context. It doesn't tell you why it's there. It doesn't tell you what it's doing. It doesn't tell you anything about its decision making. And then all of that stuff has to be kind of woven back in around our interpretation of that data. And this is what happens in the case of Susie, the green turtle, and also the shipping vessels. In the case of Susie, I'm not going to get to finish all the rest of my talk, so I'm going to tell you a summarized version, which is that Susie essentially was a green turtle. She was the first one to be tagged by the turtle program. She swam from one UK overseas territory, which was the Turks and Caicos Islands, to another overseas territory, and then onto another UK overseas territory, even though there's other islands in the Caribbean. And she was absolutely celebrated by the press in the UK and also in the Turks and Caicos Islands. I think it was the Telegraph said she's an Anglophile turtle that prefers British territories. And she was essentially created as this kind of this figurehead for UK kind of conservation. They did a lot of work to kind of build up this identity of her as this friend, and that the fishermen, but also UK conservation interested publics needed to care for and care about, and use that as a leverage point for translating this very abstract data into a sense of responsibility for them to either change their fishing practices or invest in nature conservation. On the other hand, we had the dark vessels, which really is somewhat of a dehumanization of these fishing vessels. They become treated as, they're discussed in the discourse of the people that are doing this work as threats, and they do threat assessments. They talk about intelligence. So they use the discourse of military language around intelligence, prosecution, and military patrols. And given that all of the information about why these boats are there, what are the people doing there, why are they needing to fish in these places if they are doing illegal fishing, that's all removed, and that allows and justifies and enables the state response, which is a militaristic response to managing these marine beings. So just to conclude, I just wanted to reflect on these as, could these be understood as kind of environmental fables? I see them as, I think, so these stories or fables are enabled by stripped back data of minimal animals that use ocean space, which are increasingly prominent in environmental governance. And the data, because they're so abstracted, function as highly effective resources for both scientists and governments to justify the environmental governance interventions that they see as necessary. The data streams are highly mobile, they're shareable, they're able to be used in different places at once, and they're therefore able to be received by different audiences in different ways. And the two cases showcase some of this adaptive potential, showing how those involved in data curation actively think about how this data is contextualized and interpreted into the social orders that they want the data to take effect in. So the smart ocean is smart, not only because it provides unparalleled rapid access to information about the biophysical conditions within it, but also because it provides data streams that are able to be woven into a wide variety of earthly logics that support environmental governance. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jasper. That was fascinating. Learned a lot in 30 minutes. Wet ontologies, minimal animals, liquid shifting borders. There's so much there to process and reflect on. So please start kind of thinking of a question or two for Jasper. While our next speakers are getting set up, I will just introduce them to you. So we have Isabel Richards and Ella McCarthy. Isabel is a science communicator, podcaster, and cyberneticist. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. The Australian National University. She explores science in popular fiction, the cultural meanings of science, and the relationship between humans, the environment, and emerging technologies. Isabel is also co-host of Cyburst. I feel like I'm advertising it for you. Cyburst, a next-gen science communication podcast and collaborator at ANU Popsicle, the university's science in popular communication and entertainment hub. She's passionate about sparking curiosity in people from all walks of life and transforming the way that science and technology are integrated with society in the 21st century. That's so wonderful. And Ella is a science communicator, researcher, cyberneticist, and podcaster at ANU. Ella amplifies systems thinking of relationships between technology, society, and environment to the wider cybernetic community. Ella's research interests are intersections of art and science, science accessibility, and this is great, de-jargoning expert knowledge. Ella is also co-host of Cyburst, the podcast, which is accessible for everyone. So please welcome our next two speakers, speaking on the topic of climate change fables and their calls to action.
Wow, thank you so much. So hi, everyone. We're so excited to be here today. You get two for the price of one with this presentation, so we're super excited about that. And I guess we don't really need to intro ourselves because we've just had an amazing introduction. So thank you so much for that. But I do want to provide some context as to how we got here. We are huge fans of Chris Danter, as I'm sure you all are because you're here in this room today. And we had the best discussion with Chris on our aforementioned podcast, all about fables. And we haven't stopped thinking about it, and it has been weeks. And here we are giving another take and building on the really great discussions we had with Chris on fables. And as science communicators, we got thinking about where do we see fable-like stories in our life. We're huge popular culture nerds, and we really believe that popular culture is a great way to make science more accessible. And you'll kind of see throughout this that a lot of the stories we're talking about have permeated all of your lives with or without you knowing. So Isabel's going to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. So I just want to quickly preface by saying that our talk is not about AI. It's definitely in the and other scientific fables, but we will be talking about a different kind of technology in the second half. So we thought a good place to start and set the scene a little bit was to talk about why we're interested in this topic and also give an overview of some of the ways our fellow Australian science communicators are currently driving conversations around climate change, renewable energy, and climate action. As science communicators, talking about climate change is inevitable, but not very fun. Sometimes people don't believe you. Sometimes people feel overwhelmed by the climate situation and are starting to switch off. So we're trying lots of different ways of communicating about it because it also has to reach various different groups, people, cultures. And to show how we're approaching this, I'm going to run through some recent examples of climate change communication in Australia. Okay, so the first examples are Lee Constable's educational books, How to Save the Whole Stinking Planet, which is about waste management and the impact of our household rubbish on the planet, and her more recent book published earlier this year, I think, How to Save the Whole Blinking Planet, which is about renewable energy and the impact of fossil fuels. These books are both mainly marketed towards children, but they're actually written for all ages and are very easy to digest. They've both got humor, lots of fun cartoons, and super engaging activities for people who want to get a little more hands-on. So that's the first example. Another example is Joe Duggan's Is This How You Feel project. So this project collects and displays handwritten letters from scientists who are answering the question of how climate change makes them feel. This project is really about the emotions behind scientific knowledge and climate change. And while you could say Lee Constable's books are more for those who are already willing to help save the planet, Joe's project is designed to reach the apathetic and indifferent. It's really trying to show people that climate change is a very real thing and a relatable thing that impacts everybody's lives in multiple different ways. And the final example is the Ice Stages performances and symposiums. So this one is all about our relationship with snow and ice across cultures and disciplines, especially in terms of how representations of ice can communicate environmental messages and highlight the urgency of climate action. This one is a very embodied way of communicating. And on the slide, I've got a screenshot of one of these performances where these sort of plastic sheets of ice are made to melt over time, and the performer is balancing herself among the changing landscape. Something that all three of these examples have in common is that they tell a story. And in a similar way, we think the fable is another powerful form of storytelling that can be used for climate communication. But before we get into that, Ella's going to go over a different kind of story that's been dominating conversations around climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. So I guess as science communicators and people really passionate about the planet, we're also really passionate about the types of stories people tell in these spaces. And when we were exploring the different sorts of fables after our great conversation with Chris, we were looking at a whole bunch of stories related to climate change. And we realized there's 3 distinct themes that emerged. And the first theme we're going to talk about is in the non-fable end of a spectrum. So we're going to go on a journey towards the end of fables and towards really strong fable-like stories. But we're going to start off at stories that have moral messaging that aren't fables and are human-focused rather than animal or machine-focused with some uplift. And this first theme has a little bit of harm with it. So we're going to jump into that. Now, who's heard of a carbon footprint before? I'm seeing lots of recognition in the room. So this is a type of storytelling. And the story that the carbon footprint tells is that of your individual impact in the earth. It's asking how big is the footprint, how big is the trace are you leaving based on the food you eat, the electricity you consume, what you do with your waste. And it's an encouragement for you as an individual to reduce your carbon footprint. So this doesn't seem inherently harmful, right? Like taking care of the environment, pretty good thing, I would say. However, the term carbon footprint came about in 2004 by British Petroleum. Maybe some motives there. Just going to put that out there. And in 2004, they unveiled a carbon footprint calculator and asked you and everyone on the planet to have a look at your own individual actions, shifting the blame from themselves as a huge carbon emitter. So this is a type of storytelling, a type of marketing that has moral messaging that really isn't doing the greatest good. And it actually is a shift of responsibility. As someone who was in primary school and then high school in the years following this was the only messaging that was around. It really permeated every aspect of every sustainability group that I was involved in, of kids at assemblies giving talks. And this is how kind of like the younger generation was shaped to think about climate change. It's a you first problem. It actually took 17 years. So these articles were all released in 2021 for big media to pick up that the carbon footprint wasn't a good type of storytelling when it comes to climate change. It was actually a form of denial. And here we can even see it being called a dangerous myth. So I think of this very much in opposition to a fable-like story, and a story that did a lot of harm with the moral messaging it was trying to promote, which is a bit negative. But don't worry, we have some more positive themes emerging.
Yeah, so this non-fable messaging around the carbon footprint that Ella's just gone over is still very much a gold standard of corporate climate action. But there are other popular stories centered around non-human animals, and these are what Ella and I are calling fable-like stories of climate change. And these are ones that don't quite fit the traditional format of the fable, but still heavily feature animals and moral messaging, and also use animals to sort of de-center the humans in relation to the dangerous impacts of climate change.
So here we have a Google search on images of the term climate change. And as you can kind of see, there's a lot of images of the climate changing, which makes a lot of sense. But on the right-hand side of the screen, we have two characters emerging. The sad polar bear with no iceberg. And if you look into the suggested follow-up terms, the third category is polar bear. And why is this? So the polar bear has kind of been used for years as a fable-like story to compel us into action surrounding climate change. We're supposed to feel empathy and have responsibility evoked by these images of our own actions, and then be challenged to change our actions because we care so much about this cute little polar bear. And polar bears aren't the only animal that these fable-like stories center around.
Yeah, there's also the turtle, which is the face of messaging around plastics in the ocean with phrases like skip a straw to save a turtle, or the koalas in Australia, which were really big during the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season. And these fable-like stories, whether they're a news item or a nature documentary or a meme even, are really about saving the planet and climate for the animals rather than ourselves. We can feel sad for the polar bear or koala or turtle, and maybe feel less sad for ourselves and not have to think about the direct impacts of climate change on us. Here, I think it's also important to note that it's the cute animals that are the focus of these sorts of stories and a lot of other social messaging around climate change, and that creates another problem where we're not thinking about the impact on all animals or the whole ecosystem. But even then, using cute animals does evoke a pretty powerful emotional response and has these fable-like impacts and connotations where we're compelled to act based on our morals.
Absolutely. And we aren't the first people to notice this. The End of Eden, Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown is a book published this year, and it's all about the stories that we usually tell ourselves about climate change. And these are normally human-centered stories. And this author, what they've done is they've brought together a collection of stories about wild animals, trees, bugs, ugly-looking parrots nobody seems to care about, and steps you through one by one the direct and devastating impact climate change is having on each one of these animals. So in a way, it's kind of doing the save the turtles, save the polar bears, save the koalas, all in one volume to show how much of a systematic problem this is. It's interesting, though, that these are all gone through one by one. And in these fable-like stories that Isabel and I have seen where they're communicating climate change, focusing on the one fable to stop us being emotionally burnt out by the dire systematic devastation we've caused seems to be the way through here and is the kind of easy form of messaging. Luckily, there is a third theme, and we're getting pretty positive here.
Yeah, so that brings us to our final theme for today, which are the stories that follow the traditional format of the fable. And here we're going to go over some fable classics like The Three Little Pigs and The Goose Who Lays the Golden Eggs, and how they take on a new meaning today as climate change and sustainability fables. And then we're going to move on to an entirely new fable that was actually published by an ANU researcher in 2022 and tells a story about animals, humans, and also renewable technologies. Okay, the story of the three little pigs. This is one I think we're all probably somewhat familiar with. And there are some really interesting papers, like the one we've linked up here, all about reimagining the story as a fable about climate change migration, which is often an aspect that is missing in the discourse about climate change. There are multiple versions of the Three Little Pigs, some where the wolf eats the first two pigs, some where the first two pigs aren't eaten but flee to the third brother's brick house. And in the versions where the first two pigs are eaten, the wolf blowing down their houses can be viewed as representing the worst possible climate change scenarios. So extreme weather conditions, rising sea levels, desertification, shrinking fresh water supplies, and so on, which then creates millions of environmental refugees, and only the pigs or people in places with sophisticated disaster preparedness, like the brick house, will persist. And read this way, the fable shows how the effects of climate change are distributed unevenly. In the version where the first two pigs flee to the third brother's house, the third pig, or the richer nations, welcomes his siblings, and the wealthier states, who are more responsible for the buildup of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, embrace their duty to those less fortunate. And there's also another interesting but lesser known version of the Three Little Pigs that Ella's going to go over.
Sure will. Okay, brace yourselves. This is the true story of the Three Little Pigs. Everything you think you know is wrong. The wolf, he's not a bad guy. He went to the first little pig's house. He wanted a cup of sugar. Accidentally blew over his house. Whoopsies, could happen to anyone. By the time the big bad wolf gets to the third house, he thinks he's being invited in. Come and up my chim chim chimney. That's what he thought he heard. He's not a bad guy, okay? These climate disasters, they're not his fault. And in this version of the true story of the Three Little Pigs, the big bad wolf gets a press conference and tells everyone that he's been framed. So in this version, not only is the big bad wolf representing the climate disasters that have torn down the Three Little Pigs' homes, but he's also then representing a climate change denier who is not taking responsibility for their actions. Does that sound like anything we spoke about earlier today? Maybe.
Okay, so that's the Three Little Pigs. Another classic fable is the story of the goose that laid the golden egg. And in this fable, there's a farmer who's having money troubles, and so he buys a special goose that lays one golden egg every day. But he starts getting greedy and forces the goose to lay several eggs every day, and as a result, the goose dies from exhaustion. This fable was always about sustainability. It just takes on a more specific meaning today that is related to climate change and larger scale environmental impact. The goose in the story represents the natural environment, and the egg is nature's bounty. Us humans are the greedy farmer. We want more than what we need and force nature to provide more than it can sustain. And that ends pretty badly for everybody. Okay, so those examples were a little bit doom and gloom. And Ella and I don't like doom and gloom much, and we really like to end on a positive. So we're going to talk about an entirely new fable, and one that we're both very excited about. And I think some of our ANU colleagues in the room might be familiar with this one. So this is a children's picture book titled Amy's Balancing Act, and was written by ANU academic Bjorn Sternberg, who is a research leader, part of the university's battery storage and grid integration program. So this fable is a story about climate change, transition, and renewable technology, and the power of teamwork and diversity. And ultimately, it's a way to explain to kids how to stabilize the grid in Australia in the transition away from fossil fuels. So this story is centered around Amy. Or can you go back a slide? Yeah, centered around Amy, who's pictured up there. And she delivers mail on the fictional island of Energia. And she usually does this on her horse, Clyde. But Clyde's sadly grown old and can no longer do the trips. So she has to find new ways of delivering the mail. And she does this by enlisting the help of other animals like Sol the goanna, Gale the albatross, and Snowy the glider. And they all work together to make sure the mail is delivered through different kinds of transport depending on the weather conditions. Sol delivers mail when the sun is shining, Gale when the wind is blowing day and night, and Snowy when the other two can't. What we find most interesting about Amy's balancing act is how the animals are used to represent different kinds of renewable technology. So we've got a lizard for solar cells, a bird for wind farms, and a glider for the snowy hydro. And of course, Clyde the horse, who represents coal power stations, or the old way of doing things. There's a really interesting uplift given to technology here, where being represented as animals gives the technologies more agency. It makes them feel more familiar and also emphasizes their importance both for and within the environment. In the case of Clyde the horse, he provides a way of acknowledging the service of coal, but that it's okay for us to now let go of it because we have new and improved forms of clean energy. And Bjorn, the author himself, says, quote, Amy's balancing act is more than a bedtime fable. It's an invitation to be respectful of the service coal power plants have provided, while being clear-eyed about the brighter future of an electricity system entirely powered by solar, wind, batteries, and pumped hydro. And Bjorn, in interviews, also talks a lot about how the fable is, yes, intended for kids to learn about energy in Australia, but also for the kids to persuade their parents into reading it to them to reinforce their parents' behaviors too. And in a very cybernetic way, this fable is focused on the relationships between renewable technologies in Australia and how they must work together with Amy, or humans, in the loop to oversee it all for the preservation of our planet and environment in the face of climate change.
Which brings us to a bit of a conclusion on our themes. So today we've spoken about 3 different types of storytelling, from the non-fable to the fable. The first theme we spoke about, these were non-fable, like moral storytelling forms. And their calls to action provided some harm and misinformation, and also disguised the truth. In theme 2, we spoke a lot about fable-like stories. These have kind of incomplete calls to action and don't recognize the whole system, but still impose their belief of what your reaction to reading this tale should be. Now, in the third theme that we just talked about, we were focusing on traditional, quote-unquote, scientific fables that rely on you for action. They give you a moral messaging, but don't tell you to stop using straws and that's the end of the problem. What they do is they introduce to you some knowledge and a story, and then ask you to interpret that and act on that in your own ways. They can be easily read for calls to action, but you still have to be an active part of the learning process. And that's what makes them really good forms of science communication. Fables are fantastic. And what we've realized throughout our little research dive is that they do a lot of great work. Fables help us see the bigger future and the bigger picture of what's going on. They ask us to ask our own questions. Fables, they relate to values and core morals that we hold, but again, aren't giving you a direct one-for-one action. They're asking you to look within yourself, and I believe, and we believe, that makes more systematic change. And finally, Fables. All of the final Fables we spoke about are accessible to such a wide range of audiences. They have pictures, they have short, brief sentences, and they can be given to, read by, enjoyed by every generation from children's upwards. So thank you very, very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Isabel and Ella. That was wonderful. Perhaps if we can have all three of you up the front, if that's where you'd like to sit. Great. Okay, you all have a mic. You're ready to go. Have a look, like it feels like a little UN convention on climate right now at the front here. I mean, just some points that kind of came to mind while you're thinking of questions and responses is across the three of you and your discussions, it seems like there's an interesting thread here around traditional versus updated kind of narrative conventions and what that means in the current moment, what that means in response to crisis. And across the two talks as well, the role that data and datafication kind of play in that. But one kind of thought I also had was Jasper's key term, which was also very interesting for all of this, was the question of integrity. And how that might relate to kind of thinking about authenticity in relation to AI, as it appears in some of the kind of global responses to climate catastrophe that you're touching on. Does anyone have a kind of question to get us going and open things up? Chris?
Oh, I don't know.
Everyone has a
I don't know.
mic.
Have I just picked up the bad microphone?
Sure.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, no, something I was thinking about that tied in a little bit with this morning's conversation was Jasper, I really like the idea of minimal animals because the fable is a kind of minimal narrative. And, I think Ella and Isabel, you really brought that out. Just made me think as well about what Joan was saying this morning in a sense of, for me, if there's a call to action for literary scholars, it's almost like back to basics, so interpretation, all these things that, if you're not in the field, you don't hear this debate, but, we don't need more interpretation. We've got enough, so we need something else. And I go, well, no, we actually do need those basic things because we're always applying them to new contexts. And so your stories also, your papers also brought that out beautifully of how the fable can travel. And yeah, so it's just as much a comment as but just that idea of what it means to be minimal story. And I mean, Jasper, I guess you had some dark implications, some negative implications of that too. But it's also that minimalization that's enabling the fable to travel and to speak in different contexts and so I found that just very interesting. So I've given people enough time to think of questions. So Catherine.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really enjoyed all of those different perspectives. I was really interested in both of the presentations. There was a lot of practice or discussion around the power and the politics of this. I think Jasper's was really interesting in terms of the data politics, who gets to tell the story, which one for whom. I was interested in terms of ocean governance. There are beautiful stories of people like Epeli Taofa with Our Sea of Islands and thinking about other kinds of perspectives and ways that the stories that we tell change our perceptions. And I really liked that Ella and Isabel were kind of bringing that forward to say the way we tell it, who tells it, if it's the scientists trying to show that their collection of technologies could be better than others, it's still a powerful act. And so I'd be interested in your perspectives around when we are trying to co-produce to do some of these things, who should have the power, who isn't in this room, and how might we think about that with the responsibility we have to develop maybe more powerful and better fables?
Yeah, I guess that's
such a great question, Catherine, with so many different components. And I think making sure the right people in the room is a really difficult and complex task, as we all probably know. And I know we're all benefiting a lot from this interdisciplinary symposium we've had of getting a lot of people with different backgrounds in there. And, you know, when we go to ocean governance, as Jasper was speaking about, we've got, you know, a list of who's allowed to be involved depending on which part of the water you're in. And that's without even touching on who from those countries is allowed to be involved, or from those islands or wherever are allowed to be involved at the decision-making level. Is it just governors? Do the people on these dark vessels get a say? What would happen if they were involved in the conversation? It is about them too. But then also, how can we make sure the room isn't so big that nothing comes out of it? Would Fables be the correct way to pursue this form of storytelling? I don't know. I think they make a very, very compelling start, and a great basis for us to form, you know, the start of a good discussion from, getting everyone up to have some shared language and a shared story.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think with the ocean, it's interesting. What I've found is that with the ocean, because the scales are so vast and the resources needed to access the kinds of data, and also also access the rooms in which decisions are made and where spokespeople are allowed to speak, that governments have a lot of control over the narrative. And in collaboration with large-scale NGOs, conservation NGOs, who I think they already have these established ideas about the narratives that are appropriate and what they want, the ways in which they see the world. So if I continued my talk, I identified like 3 kind of social orders that they operated within. First one was like a geopolitical one, which is basically a embedding of sovereignty as an ideal, and the need for governments to be sovereign over their waters and to demonstrate responsibility through sovereign control, which partnered with the second one, which is around militarization of ocean space, and the need to protect it through defense mechanisms. And then the final one was through using capital and capital accumulation as a mean of selling nature to save it, and essentially how the data is used as a mean, and the representation of these global fishing watch, which is the big the view that you can go online and look at, which is where all the fishing boats are. I have a great quote from someone saying, we can sell something that people can see from space. You know, it's like, and they're like, splat, right there, it's a giant dinner plate in the middle of the Atlantic. And you can sell that to a philanthropist, right? To be like, and they say, it's not just saving a couple of obscure bird species. This is like something that you can look at from space. And that's exciting for people. But the kinds of people that have access to invest at that level, to monitor, to enforce, is all about kind of government control and traditional forms of power. And I think one point that I wanted to make but didn't get a chance to was that there's a kind of, within the tech world, and this idea of, even the idea of the smart ocean, there's this kind of myth or suggestion that like the delivery of all of this data is going to somehow democratize the governance system, that, you know, that the data doesn't see the borders, and that it will follow the fish across the borders. It will generate global surveillance systems that don't see kind of government territories. But in actual fact, when the data is actually used, it's often being used in very traditional forms of power, which is sovereign power, military power, and capital power, rather than really democratizing and overcoming the boundaries that those things create. So, yeah.
Sorry, I missed the hands up. So is it Pierre and then Joan?
Yes. Thank you very much. Both talks resonated a lot with my health background. images of oceans or images of lungs or brains, and the fables of this evolution of stories. Like in the 70s, pregnant women were told that it's better to smoke than to suffer from anxiety during pregnancy. And this narrative has completely flipped now that we have looked at data properly. And of course, it was fed by the cigarette makers that, doctors smoke Camels in the 70s advertisement. And putting on that the concept of sovereignty made me think about the concept of One Health, that we can't solve human health issues if we don't solve planet health issues, and vice versa. And yesterday's China brain experiment, or whatever it was, really, like, could you heal a brain while the rest of the organs would want to keep their sovereignty? No, it couldn't work, and vice versa. So is it time to really admit that just the concept of government and nations and all that, like, what's the point of trying to fix the problem around them? They are the problem. And let's be brave and face it. So I know it's a tough question, but do you think it's doable?
So the question is how to overcome the problem of sovereign nation-based sovereign control of everything. Yeah. Yeah.
It was a useful tool in human evolution. But can we evolve further with this tool?
Yeah. Does someone else want to reflect on that? Yeah. Okay.
So I know Dave Snowden, and I know his work very well, and he's always favoured in sort of fables, myths and legends, the concept of archetypes. And if this is remotely at all about who you or one perceives oneself to be, whether it's a sovereign nation or a person, or therefore two people having a dispute, two countries having a dispute. I mean, we've seen it in Ukraine and Russia and other places. So who you think you are seems to be at the root of this, because you can't be an us if you're two identities. So maybe if we can just throw archetype in there. I mean, the animal is an archetype. I mean, if you can think of yourself or a country as an archetype. I've got a young lady who was born in Russia living in my household. I can only sigh and say it's very difficult to bring yourself out of where you were born and where you were grown up. But that maybe just be, we have to tell a new story about ourselves as individuals to be able to retell the stories between us. And whether there's any comments on how you can shift your own story to be able to be with other stories. I'm sure you can say something there.
Oh. Well, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, and this is. I think that I can talk about what I'm been interested in around this, which is comes back to this question of integrity, and basically the idea of the state and sovereign control is linked to ideas of like borders and integrity of those borders, and not being relational in how you think about things and relate, and yeah, seeing parts and the arrow. Yeah, I don't know. It stimulates so many different thoughts. It comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about people and nature as being separate entities that are somehow have their own sovereignty, rather than being something that's kind of entangled through lots of different relationships. And there is something in how we think about the world that makes us feel comfortable when we think about things as separate. But in actual fact, we live in a world that's very interconnected.
But that sort of presents that it's just with actions.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can adopt a kind of actor network theory type approach. I think, well, it's all about how we imagine, but then you have systems of structures. And so we still operate in a world that has government structures, government centralized decision-making, you know, rooms that some people are allowed in, other people aren't, or chains of authority, you know, like it's embedded throughout the whole system. And so I don't think that we can get rid of it without thinking at a systems level about how we organize everything, basically. Yeah.
So question here then. So Joan first and then Stephanie.
Thanks. Thank you. That was great. I wanted to talk a little bit about affect, or have you talk a little bit about affect? Because one of the things yesterday when we were talking about the fable, you know, retelling the fable, the fox and the ass, and you sit there and you think, boy, that fox, you know, you actually feel like, that, wow, that was really not on, right? Okay. And so, you know, Three Little Pigs, we care whether the pigs make it. What's really interesting to me is the kind of science communication, let's use the fable to do something didactic, might evacuate some of that affect, because I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about these fables. I'm thinking about the Britophile turtle as fable, and I understand the kind of identity that incites as affect. And those early examples you gave of the ice stages of, you know, the dancer and the world really melting around them as a fable. And I feel that, the affect. And then I get to delivering the mail. And I think, okay, I get it. But something about that doesn't feel as immediate or as affective. And so I guess what I'm interested in is the way in which these fables need to rely on a certain affective register that is actually pretty elemental. So you talked this morning about disgust or shame and these kinds of things that were up on, and that's where Aesop's the master, right? I mean, it's disgust, it's shame, it's horror. And I wonder how integral that is to fable and how that plays in the examples that you've given.
That's a really good point. And I think that, yeah, you're right. The affect plays into both. There is a disgust element in the foreign invader of the fishermen, you know, in these kind of sneaking into UK waters to steal fish. Yeah. And even the language used to describe them. And then the turtle, she is charismatic and patriotic and like all these other things that make us feel a particular way. Yeah. And that adds, could you tell the same story if there was a worm that traveled around the same trajectory, or you know, does it matter how charismatic the animal is? Does it matter what kind of emotions it evokes? Yes, I would say, yeah.
So, sorry, Joan, were you saying that you kind of, I guess, got more or felt more from something like the Ice Ages Symposium as compared to like the Delivering the Mail story? Yeah, okay. Interesting. Yeah, okay.
Kind of extract a narrative.
Yeah.
Extract it. And look, I mean, affect itself is difficult, right?
Yeah.
But when you start to abstract that, I don't know, it just doesn't feel as immediate or whatever. So this is just me, this is my reaction. So I'm just wondering if you...
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I don't know how, because obviously the Amy's Balancing Act is for children. I don't know how children have responded to it, but I know he specifically wrote it for like his new baby as well. That's funny. I do know, which I think ties into your point, is that at the end of the book, he actually does go through and like explain each of it, which is interesting to just mention, I think, there.
Yeah, I wonder, because basically mail is kind of like it's supposed to represent all the things electricity does for us. And that's a lot of things. So whether it, you know, there would be more affect if we if instead of mail, it was cooling to deliver like a lung transplant, or heating in the winter before everyone, you know, turns to ice blocks. Like there are so many different things that can stand in for like the essential form and like the essential, I guess, like delivery and object of electricity. I find it very interesting that Bjorn chose to go with communication. And I guess kind of as Chris was talking about with the tech outage last week, we actually, you know, we think we can function without technology and the communication it affords us, but actually communication is at the center of so much of what we do, and it's trusted for so many different things, that systems of communication are so essential that most of what we do would break down without them, which I guess is something that the fable doesn't go into. But yeah, when I see mail, I see like essential forms of communication. But I have read the book quite a few times.
Charlotte.
Oh yeah, I was just oh God, now I'm really nervous about how to use this. I was thinking about, there's a great book by Wendy Chun called Discriminating Data, where she goes through some of the sociological and scientific concepts that undergird machine learning systems. And she observes that the way that machine learning systems effectively predict the future is by making it conform with the past, because machine learning systems are trained on the past. But she distinguishes that from the way that climate models, you know, the famous hockey stick graph works, these sort of simulation models that present a possible future in order to invite different action, do you know what I mean, in the present. And I was thinking about the way that fables have a kind of foregone conclusion, you know, they could be said to close down possible futures. And I wonder if you have any reflections on, yeah, the ways that fables or fabulous stories in their kind of closing, I mean, maybe you disagree with this characterization of them, Chris, but in the way that they do have a kind of foregone conclusion, how much do they, prompt new action?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And the first part of when you were speaking, all I was thinking of, oh my goodness, maybe the mail is data, which separate conversation. But oh no, I lost my train of thought. Oh, the golden goose, the fable of the golden goose. I was thinking about the end of that and how rather than it trying to, you know, be like, and because of our greed, we're heading towards the end of the world because we've taken all of nature's resources prematurely and in a non-sustainable way. I think it's actually warning against that ending. So in that way, I see it kind of opening up more futures in that specific fable. So I wonder if there's, you know, a few different categories of these fables, some which lead us towards a certain future and some which are meant to lead us away from other futures.
Yeah, and I think that also comes back to the sort of each fable has a different, slightly different version of the story as well. So with the golden goose, I didn't want to touch on it because it's a bit gory, but there's a version of the story where the farmer actually cuts open the goose to get the eggs. So yeah, I think it's interesting that there's different versions, maybe like similar outcome, but different way of getting there.
The ones were pretty dark, some of the fables.
Yeah. Yeah.
Being retold. A bit like the war thing.
I had the pleasure of attending another conference, and it was a lecturer had the problem, how does he teach climate change? And taking into account the type of people he was talking about, and that everybody was associated with Dungeons and Dragons. And so what he did, he asked all the students to take a character in this mythical world that had suffered climate change, and they had to survive as a group, and they had to go through all these are all the issues. How do you do it? And how do you get power? How do you get shelter? And he reported it was really, really enthusiastic. So just as an idea. Because people understand Dungeons and Dragons.
Just on just the foregone conclusion, I think it's interesting that the stories about the turtle and these fishing vessels is already a story that's like been reproduced so many times in aid of state sovereignty for like hundreds of years. And yeah, was it a foregone conclusion that would be those would be the narratives that would be used to that would be mobilized to explain this data? And how consistent is that over time? I don't know, or for different things. I find that very interesting. But how do you break out of those foregone conclusions of those narratives and tell alternative narratives that might be more honest or relational? And it's interesting with the Golden Goose one, because to me, the Golden Goose one adopts a logic of nature giving to people that I would disagree with. But then if I wanted to retell that narrative in a way that is more relational, rather than nature kind of providing abundance for people, could you still use a goose and a golden egg? Or would you have to like completely restructure? Would you have different characters? Would you have to have different characters? Or yeah, I don't know. Or would you just change the conclusion? Or like, how would you do that? I don't know. Interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. I've enjoyed hearing your stories, and I appreciate your trying to build in systems to make people more accountable, organisations and corporations more accountable across the board through your stories. And I'm just thinking about building on what you're saying about the stories and how you're coming from a fable position from the past with the values and a story that you're trying to reinforce, but with some fables that are rooted in the past, and yet there's a changing future. And you're talking about the fables being retold in different ways. I'm wondering, because historically humans have used oral stories where when the storyteller or the story holder will hold that story, and they will actually, when they retell that story, they'll shift the story each time they retell it. So I think there's an issue around sticking to a story that stays the same, which is from the past, and one that is more evolving to the current and future, and maybe looking at perhaps having oral stories is a way around some of this, but also in a written form as well. I'm wondering whether that's something worth thinking about to help reorientate people.
Yeah, I completely agree with the sentiment of what you were saying. And I think one of the best parts about fables and really, really good fables is how adaptable they are. And, everyone tells them, or, traditionally they would be told by different storytellers who would have their own spin and then would hear something else and perhaps change their own spin a little bit. So it's interesting with the ones that we've, ended up with that are picture books and are kind of printed in, I guess, form a part of a canon that can change, but once it's printed, there is a record of how it was. Which I guess is a really interesting idea to think about in terms of adaptability of fables.
So I think we have one last question from online. So Charlie.
Yeah, via the chat, I have a question from Kauri Nagai for Jasper. If you were to write a fable about ocean governance, where would you begin?
Oh, where would I begin? About ocean governance? Wow. I don't know. My mind goes to the deep sea, maybe because that's the kind of hotly contested area of the ocean at the moment. Yeah, maybe some microbe that doesn't need sunlight and kind of lives in the deep sea, in an ocean vent, and whether or not it's going to be subjected to deep sea mining to power the energy transition, something like that. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, I don't know.
Okay, great. I do love the way in which the relative anonymity of the chat produces the boldest, juiciest questions, just like thrown in there at the last second. Thank you very much to the three of you. That was really enlivening and inspiring and a really productive and I think really useful series of questions for us to think through, especially at the kind of end of some of the discussions we've been having. So please join me in thanking our penultimate panel. Much appreciated. And now we're at lunch for 1 hour before we're back here. Thank you.